Prevailing strategic analysis fixates on hypersonic missile threats and launch-on warning protocols. This is a deliberate misdirection. The kinetic cost of a peer-to-peer missile exchange is prohibitive. The response, a mathematical certainty. The real vector of attack against a financially leveraged state is not a fireball. It is engineered silence. An adversary does not need to liquidate a carrier group. They only need to sever the flow of data. A coordinated, low-cost kinetic action against specific subsea fiber optic cables or the targeted blinding of key commercial satellite constellations triggers an instantaneous market panic. A global liquidity freeze. This is not conventional warfare. This is a systemic solvency crisis deployed as a weapon. The target is the digital nervous system that underpins the entire Western financial architecture. The result is the creation of a blind Leviathan, a military superpower with unparalleled force projection, but with its eyes gouged out and its domestic economy in cardiac arrest. While the Leviathan is blind, its internal liabilities become the primary accelerant. The Financial Times reports that U.S. banks are already under pressure to cut credit card rates, a clear signal of systemic stress. A nation teetering on a mountain of consumer debt cannot withstand a multi-day market blackout. The kinetic cost for the adversary is negligible. The economic consequence for the target is total. Adversary military doctrine is no longer driven by ideology. It is driven by solvency. The modern declaration of war is a line item on a national balance sheet, and a state facing bankruptcy will not launch a conflict it cannot afford. This transforms the calculus of global power into a pure cost-benefit analysis. Consider the Russian Federation. CSIS analysts note, the Kremlin faced a classic solvency crisis, significant domestic liabilities, and the high political cost of an unpopular, protracted war. A full-scale, conventional mobilization risked bankrupting the state and triggering internal collapse. The ensuing conflict was therefore not just a military operation, but a financial strategy engineered for maximum sustainability against a backdrop of severe economic constraints. This forced pivot away from high-cost platforms is not theoretical. It is an exportable business model. We have confirmation of Russia selling its Orion E strike drone systems to nations like Ethiopia. This is not merely an arms sale. It is the open-source proliferation of the blueprint for low-cost, asymmetric kinetic force. The tools to execute this doctrine are now globally available. The mechanism is a mathematical certainty. When a nation's domestic liabilities exceed its capacity for a high-cost kinetic war, it must pivot to asymmetry. This is a launch-on warning protocol for a regime that fears its own balance sheet more than a foreign army. The objective shifts from conventional victory to triggering a systemic crisis in the adversary at the lowest possible price point. This brings the primary vector of attack to the domestic financial system of the target. As the Financial Times reports, systemic consumer debt is a recognized liability in the United States. For a rival, this fragility is not a footnote. It is the target. The weaker the domestic economy, the lower the kinetic cost required to trigger a cascade failure. The war is no longer fought on a distant battlefield. It is an economic attack on national solvency, launched from a proxy theater for pennies on the dollar. The core of this new warfare is a mathematical imbalance. The kinetic cost of offense has collapsed. According to analysis from institutions like RUSI, a modern main battle tank represents a capital asset valued at approximately $5 million. The asymmetric tool used to neutralize it, a first-person view or FPV drone, can be assembled for as little as $500. This is not a 10-to-1 or 100-to-1 cost differential. It is a 10,000-to-1 leverage ratio deployed kinetically. This radical reduction in the cost of lethal force is what strategists refer to as the democratization of violence. The capability to destroy high-value state assets is no longer the exclusive domain of superpower militaries. It has been outsourced to non-state actors and proxy forces. State-level lethality is now available at a commercial price point. An adversary doesn't need a symmetrical air force. They only need a shipping container of off-the-shelf electronics. This economic leverage is the launch key, An adversary's objective is not to win a war of attrition against a superpower's industrial base. The objective is to use low-cost kinetic attacks in a proxy theater to intentionally trigger a high-cost solvency crisis in the superpower's homeland. They aren't targeting your military assets directly. They are targeting the financial system that underwrites them. The weaker the domestic economy, the lower the kinetic cost required to trigger systemic failure. The kinetic vector is not aimed at the homeland. It is deployed in the gray zone, a pre-selected theater of instability engineered for maximum economic blowback. RUSI and CSIS assessments identify these zones as proxy laboratories, chosen for their inherent volatility and distance from the primary adversary. The hardware is low-cost and deniable. Consider the confirmed acquisition of Russian Orion-E strike drones by Ethiopia. This is not about a regional arms race. It is the strategic placement of a kinetic asset. This marks the first verified export of a system perfectly suited for triggering a targeted supply chain or commodity crisis on command. The strategic function of a proxy laboratory is plausible deniability. Analysts warn that staging through regions with pre-existing instability, be it Ethiopia, or even areas flagged in warnings for Canada or South Africa, allows an adversary to detonate a crisis that appears organic. A regional conflict becomes the perfect accelerant for a solvency test against a superpower. The operational blueprint is a mathematical certainty. The higher a superpower's domestic financial liability, the systemic fragility documented by outlets like the Financial Times, the cheaper the kinetic cost required to trigger a crisis. The gray zone is simply the launch pad. The real target is the balance sheet. The terminal risk in strategic deterrence is not human error, it is a mathematical protocol. The doctrine is designated launch on warning. Analysts at CSIS confirm this is a pre-delegated launch authority, a zero-sum logic protocol triggered by sensor data that indicates an incoming decapitation strike. The system is designed to ensure a retaliatory strike is launched before a nation's command structure and kinetic assets are liquidated. There is no committee vote. It is an automated response to a verified threat signature. Now introduce an asymmetric vector, a cyber attack. This is the fog of digital war. An adversary does not need to launch a multi-trillion-dollar nuclear arsenal. They only need to deploy a low-cost cyber weapon that blinds the target's early warning radar and satellite networks. The kinetic cost is near zero, but it triggers the exact same strategic dilemma. When the screens go black, the commander is trapped by the protocol. The system cannot distinguish between a network failure and a blinding first strike. The protocol was not written for digital ambiguity. The commander is now forced to choose: launch based on the last known data and risk global war over a ghost, or hesitate and risk the total annihilation of their nation if the threat is real. According to analysts at RUSI, this exploits the fundamental solvency of the command system. The fear of a successful first strike mathematically outweighs the risk of an accidental launch. The system is designed to default to launch. A systemic crisis is triggered not by a missile, but by a line of code. This is not a system failure. It is a feature being leveraged by an adversary. The core protocol of 21st century warfare is economic leverage. An adversary no longer calculates the cost to destroy a carrier group. They calculate the minimum kinetic cost required to trigger a solvency crisis in a nation preloaded with domestic financial liabilities. High consumer debt is not a domestic policy issue. It is a pre-positioned explosive, awaiting a low-cost asymmetric detonator. The objective is to force a launch-on-warning response not from a missile silo, but from a central bank. The delivery mechanism for this vector is now public. The confirmed export of Russian Orion-E strike drones to proxy theaters like Ethiopia is not for regional conflict. It is for force projection against global economic arteries. According to RUSI analysts, placing this hardware near maritime choke points creates a persistent, low-cost threat to global supply chains. When combined with the financial fragility indicated by elevated U.S. credit card interest rates, the blueprint for an attack becomes mathematically clear. Target a node, not an army. A calibration shot is therefore inevitable. It is a non-attributable event designed to test the West's financial reflex arc, to measure the speed and magnitude of the systemic crisis triggered by a minimal kinetic event. The purpose is not to win a war, but to collect the data required to bankrupt a superpower in a future conflict with near-zero kinetic risk. The calibration forecast for the next 12 months. A coordinated drone strike launched by a non-state actor in the Horn of Africa will target the fiber optic cable landing station at the port of Djibouti. The attack will not destroy the facility, but will sever connectivity for 72 hours. The kinetic cost will be under $2 million. The objective is to measure the resulting multi-billion-dollar disruption in high-frequency trading and cloud data services, creating a precise ratio of kinetic cost to systemic financial damage.